Tell me about a time where you came up with a simple solution to a complex problem. Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be here today with Eric to do a program management mock interview. We're going to be focusing on an Amazon type question. They often talk about leadership principles and are more behavioral in nature, and so that's what we will be digging into today. But before we jump into that, Eric, could you just share a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Eric Sifka. I am an Exponent graduate. I am currently a program manager on the AWS EC2 team, and I help set up programs for our clients to best move to the cloud.
Awesome. Well, we're super excited to have you, Eric. Always cool to have a community member come back and give back to the community. So I want to start off with the question, and we can do a little bit of back and forth with it too. But the question today will be, tell me about a time where you came up with a simple solution to a complex problem.
Absolutely. And this ties into Amazon's Invent and Simplify leadership principle. So let me tell you about a time when I was the project manager on a NetSuite implementation for in a previous role for a cloud partner. So as part of the work that we were doing with the partner, we provided computing services using one of the FANG company's technologies. The company that we worked with would send us the bill. We would then provide that along to the customer, and we would in part be responsible for follow-up and making sure that the customer was paying their bills essentially. As part of a NetSuite implementation, so a major ERP implementation, we needed to perform an extract, transform, load process. So we needed to pull all the records out of our legacy billing systems, transform them into the appropriate upload format for our new ERP system, and then load them into that new system so that we would have a continuity of data, even though we were switching systems. So we started with 13,000 unmatched transaction pairs. We had a data scientist and a database administrator as part of the team that was responsible for this ETL load process. Across the work that we had done so far, we had narrowed this initial large data set down from the 13,000 initial transaction sets down to you would call them maybe the 4,000 dirtiest transactions, the ones that couldn't be matched by simple matching logic and needed a lot more in-depth investigation. So the task we were looking at is how do we best take these 4,000 pairs of transactions that were entered by hand and keyed off of manually entered phrases and keywords, and how do we match them up as quickly as possible, and of course using as few resources as possible, since we could use these resources, our database administrator and our data scientist, either on other aspects of our ERP implementation, or in a other client billing roles, or other scenarios that we could have them do it just as their day-to-day responsibilities. So when we take a look at that 4,000 transaction set, the question is, should we be using maybe some more in-depth natural language processing or better SQL matching logic, or is there a different, better way to potentially match these using maybe just human review? So what we did and what I led as part of the project plan that I was putting together and updating was to take with the database administrator a list of those 4,000 transactions, break them down into individual buckets to say that, hey, this group of transactions is perhaps missing the key ID that we should be keying off of, so someone needs to go and research that. Versus, in this set of transactions in the second bucket, the key ID is present but isn't lined up to the format that we would expect. Versus another set where potentially we have both key IDs but they're not matching to anything else, so they weren't able to be picked up using matching logic. So potentially a record is missing, or potentially they were incorrectly entered. But if you took a look at some of the other pieces of information on the record, you could potentially see which other transaction it should be matched to. So we broke them up into separate buckets. I sat with the data scientist to try and get an estimate of how long it would take to do this research. So that includes both the core for each bucket, as well as any exceptions to that. And then based on that, we were able to provide a list, essentially an hour estimate of how long it would take to create tools using either SQL, other more high octane matching software, or potentially going out and onboarding some experts in matching logic. And we had an hour estimate for to essentially create or find and onboard those tools. We stacked that up against some input from our finance team. So sitting with the finance and billing team, we took a look at the transactions that their team had entered, and we took a subset of those and said, okay, based on these example transactions, approximately how long would it take for you to go and do the research for each one of these buckets, find the information that's missing or incorrectly entered, correct them, and run them through our existing model to match them and appropriately put them in the completed set of transactions. We took both of those pieces of information. I calculated both the overall hours as well as the cost for the automated way versus the manual processing way or manual review way. After that, we were able to provide an hour estimate based on both the billable rates for our data scientists and DBAs against a billable rate for temp organizations in our surrounding location. So we were able to essentially come up with a dollar estimate and an hour estimate just to see how long it would take us to both automatically and manually match these transactions. Once we had that information, we were actually able to make a fairly clear decision to pivot away from building more in-depth tools and get away from the automatically matching logic that we had been building so far, because using the temporary help and onboarding some additional resources would have been about a 30% less expensive, as well as a lot more repeatable and a lot more solid in our hours estimates, whereas we had a wide range of uncertainty in the automatic matching logic. We actually had a fairly good handle on exactly how long it would take for the manual matching. So based on that, we did decide to move forward. I presented the case to our project leadership, and we got sign off to both reduce the number of hours for our DBA and data scientists, and we were able to reassign them to different parts of the project. And we were able to onboard 3 temporary workers that were able to sit with our finance team, get supervision, and then run through the list of transactions and manually match them based on the input that the finance team and the guidance that the finance team was able to provide. So at the end of the day, we both ended up with a solution that was cheaper, approximately 30% cheaper, as well as something that was a lot more, as a project manager, able to build a project plan around, because there was much less uncertainty in the number of hours that we thought it was going to require our team to spend. So after all that, we were able to stick on track to our ETL process. We were able to match the entirety of the transactions. The workers would go in, they would correct or change any information. They would get approval for all the transactions from finance. We'll put them back into our model. They would be lined up with other transactions, and the project was able to move forward and be successful because we were able to create a solution that was simpler than building a new set of matching logic, as well as cheaper, and of course a lot more repeatable, just in terms of the hours we were spending.
Awesome. Well, Eric, I have a couple follow-up questions that I'd love to ask you before we kind of wrap. First of all, I mean, sounds like a really awesome process that you've discovered, and you kind of simplified this a lot, which is awesome. And again, yeah, at Amazon, invent and simplify is the leadership principle. It's so related to this. If you were to go back and do it over again, what would you do differently?
Great question. So at the start of our ETL process, of course, we didn't know what we didn't know. So I think the first thing I would do is, instead of just handing the task off in its entirety to our 2 data resources, I would have sat with them just to see if we can do that bucketing exercise. Hey, which transactions are fairly clean, which transactions might need some minor touches, which transactions really need some in-depth analysis. That would have given us a little more information and would have provided more context for choosing which path to go down. So if I had known at the very start of the project that we had 9,000 transactions we could knock out with logic immediately, 2,000 transactions that we can make small tweaks to and load them back into our model, and then 2,000 ones that would need manual revision no matter what we did on the logic side. That would have given me a lot more insight into the path we should have taken, and also would have let me go immediately from the matching logic, hey, is this working, is this not working, from the initial phase into the decision to pull in resources to manually review those transactions. The process I was explaining, while it was something that we were able to set up a process for, it did cut into the project budget, and it did cut into our decision-making time, just because we did need to sit down as a team and do that bucketing exercise. So if I had to do it, I definitely would have done the same thing again, but I would have moved up the information gathering phase to the start and done that bucketing exercise instead of doing it once we had exhausted the initial batch of transactions using the most simple method based on our current resources.
Got it. That's awesome. Thanks for answering that. One follow-up question that I had, and maybe this can be the last follow-up question. As you go through this process, simplifying and maybe changing the original plan, there's certainly a lot of emotions involved, or maybe people had things in a certain way that they wanted to do things. How did you manage that, or tell me the story about how that came up throughout this process?
And it was actually an interesting group of personalities. If you're familiar with the data field, you might say that, hey, maybe a data scientist is like a little too specialized for these types of projects, or maybe a database administrator isn't the perfect resource to do this type of matching logic. But we had the resources that we had on the project. And just in terms of the two specific individuals I was working with, the data scientist was extremely gung-ho about making very specific models and using the best tools available. So with him, it was an exercise to really sit down and say, hey, even though we could build the kind of best of breed Cadillac of matching logic, is that really what's going to be the best way forward for the project? So with that specific resource, we wanted to kind of rein in, creating the perfect solution that would 100% of the time match 100% of the transactions. On the other side, when we were working with the database administrator, he came from a place where he was used to working with data that was not perfect, and really was not something that you would necessarily want to load into a new system. But for him, that was sort of the output of bad processes. So there was a little bit of personality clash between our finance stakeholders, who of course had been responsible for entering the information into the system, versus our database administrator, who of course was responsible for then using and having to create a way to match this data to other transactions in the system, even though the data wasn't that great. So I had to manage both expectations in terms of timeline and resources to create the perfect way for the data scientist to match these transactions based on something that was more pragmatic, but then also manage the database administrator from going back to the finance team, essentially just yelling at the finance team that they needed to clean up their data. So there was a little bit of personality there. There was a little bit of really making sure that everyone was oriented to the project objective. And then, when we were looking at this final solution, everyone had a good idea of what our end goal was, which was, not just to match these transactions, do them in the quickest and cheapest way so the project could keep going on the same budget as quickly as possible.
Awesome. Well, Eric, thanks so much. You can take off the interviewee hat. You did a great job. That was so awesome. I would love to hear from you a little bit more about feedback. We believe in feedback at Exponent, but also self-feedback being really, really important. What do you think went well? What do you think you would change about that particular interview answer? And I can jump into what I thought you did really well after you share a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did have a really good experience onboarding. When I was interviewing, I had a really good experience interviewing. When I was working with a recruiter, they really let me know the types of answers that they were looking for. And a lot of the things that I was doing during the interview really matched that process. So you of course want to stick with the STAR method. So the situation, task, action, result, that definitely helped. The other thing that I will say is you always want to make sure that you are providing the result in terms of as hard numbers as possible. So, I didn't just say like, hey, we were able to reduce costs. I said, hey, this was a 30% reduction in our estimated costs. And that was something that I know that all my interviewers were really keying off of. That's something that they really want to hear, because anyone can say like, oh yeah, it was great, I thought it was great. But what you really want to sell is a kind of ironclad thing that, hey, the numbers don't lie, I saved 30% of this budget. So I definitely, I think, did a good job sticking with that. For that particular interview question, I had selected a scenario which would have been fairly familiar to my interviewers. There were some other interview questions I had that pulled from my non-cloud related experience from some of my previous roles. And that was a little more difficult to explain, just because I had to not only provide the context of the project or the task I was working on, I also had to provide occasionally context for the larger industry that I was working on. I used to work in healthcare billing, and I had a scenario where I was working on a way of sending healthcare bills that complied to very, very specific healthcare regulations. And it was a scenario that, I thought showed, really good initiative in me creatively applying our system to match those regulations. But it really boiled down to kind of a conversation between me and my interviewer with like, why does the American healthcare system work like this? So I would definitely try to use more applicable examples, even if they weren't as, maybe as strong examples, or, I didn't have quite as good numbers to show this, but it was still an industry, or it was still an area where my interviewers would be comfortable with.
Awesome. Well, Eric, I'm going to jump into some of the feedback that I thought went really well, and then we can kind of wrap right after that. Overall, I thought, a lot of what you said, like the STAR method, you used it really effortlessly, and you also didn't really rely too much on the framework. It didn't feel rigid or uncomfortable when you were talking. It felt very natural and smooth, which is really great. I thought you did a great job mentioning technical concepts. You really dove in, and I think the key insight I want the viewer to take away here is to know your audience when you talk. Depending on who you're talking to, you may want to play that up or dial that down. And it really depends on who's asking and why they might be asking. So know your audience when you go into these interviews. But I thought you did a great job demonstrating that technical know-how. I thought you did a really good job throughout the interview setting up the problem. You said things like, okay, and then, now the question was this, or like, now the situation was this. Now we had to decide between this and this. And I think that almost like bookmarked the interview in a nice way, and then also kind of helped summarize repeatedly throughout the interview and helped get me on the same page as you about what the decision was and what you had to go through. So I thought that was really effective. I also think you did a great job kind of being relatable and conversational in your tone. I think if I could change one thing, it would be interacting with me a little bit more as an interviewer, and it's easy to go off on the stories, and the stories are really valuable. But just also checking in with me, being like, hey, do you know what that is? Or this system, as I mentioned, was this, or something like that. That's a little more engaging to the interviewer. I know we're in a little bit of an artificial setting where this is like a mock interview, but that would be one other tip that I recommend. And then otherwise, I do think, depending on the audience, the technical nature of what you talked about may go over or under someone's head. So just thinking about that is also helpful. But overall, Eric, this is like a really kick-ass interview. Like, you did a great job. It was such a great example for people to see, especially for Amazon and their leadership principles, specifically of the simplifying and inventing, or invent and simplify leadership principle. I want to create some space, Eric, if you have any last comments, thoughts, reactions before we close the video.
No, absolutely. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the Exponent course. I definitely relied very heavily on it during my interview prep. I know that I've also gotten a lot of, kind of requests for feedback or requests for mocks from the Exponent community. So I would definitely say, hey, leverage that as much as you can. The more times you run through this and the more opportunities you have to polish your story, the better it's going to look, even if you have a really good story already.
Totally. Exponent super, super strongly believes in the value of practice. And so that's why we've built, not only these courses and these mock interview videos, but also we have a whole interview question database where you can practice your interviews, where you can type up answers. And we also have built a peer-to-peer mock interviewing tool where you can get matched with practice partners for your upcoming interviews. So definitely use those resources. Eric, it's always great to see an Exponent member come and give back to the community. So thank you again for doing that. And to those of you watching, good luck on your upcoming interview.